All right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman. Thank you for being here. You know the drill. As always, like, comment, subscribe. If you are not a new listener, if you're a new listener, I'll let you off the hook. Don't worry about it. You don't even know if you do like the podcast or, what could you have to comment on? What could you have to say? I mean, the episode just started. So in the case you're a new listener, just sit back and enjoy. These podcasts come out weekly. I mean, like you'll see. If you like it, tune in. And if you like it after this episode and you want the push notification, go ahead. If you're on YouTube, hit that notification bell and it will let you know. It'll alert you. It'll tell you when there's new stuff up. I got new stuff coming up, coming out really like every day at this point, because we do have them segmented into shorter, more digestible pieces. I know a few of you had actually requested that, had said, I love the longer episodes, but sometimes on the way to a commute or whatever it might be, I just want something that is easy to listen to and digest. Don't want to lose my place. Don't want to backtrack. So yes, you have been heard. Thank you for that. Okay. So what are we talking about today? Today we are getting into a topic that I'll say, like, in my time in bodybuilding, I found this has been really the solution that has allowed me to go into building phases and, proceed through them successfully. This in itself, this concept, these tools, if you will. Oh, okay. I feel the niacin flush coming on. So that's happening. Only took a little bit of niacin before this. So hopefully I don't get too red. But anyways, continuing. Building metrics. That is what we're talking about today. Now, a lot of people, they will fall into these camps where, you either have the individual who is very, very aware of the scale weight going up, very sensitive to it. I think I fall into that category thus far. I mean, like, I've been through multiple builds where the scale weight, has inherently dictated the duration in which I would go into that build. As well as the degree I would, in some ways even be adherent. Because in the case, like, I wasn't really gaining weight and be like, oh, okay, I can get away with more. Not the best approach, not the best idea. And it wasn't until I would say really last year, no, a little bit before that, because I had these tools in place during my prep in 22. And once I had these tools in place, I was able to begin pre-collecting that data for the build itself. I was collecting these data points during prep, and ultimately it put me in a position where then I had reference points to essentially weigh against once I started to gain weight, once I started to go into this intentional growth phase. Now, what I'll say for individuals who are not familiar with, my thoughts around, like, entering a build, entering a state in which we're trying to grow. This phase, you need to have a decent amount of runway. And the term runway, I know that can throw people for a loop. What does that mean? Essentially, that is the amount of time that which you have available to you to be in a surplus, in a state of growth, in a phase where building muscle ultimately is your primary goal. Now, I'll give you an example, because I think people they may like, well, why, if you need to build a lot of muscle, why wouldn't you just stay in this phase indefinitely until you hit that goal? So two parts to this. There's the psychological and the physiological. Now, the psychological, I think it plagues most women that I work with. And I think more often than not just women, men too, but it is something that essentially is that radar, that precondition, that essentially tells you, like, past this point on the scale, or past this look, this body fat that, visually you're kind of assessing, I am a big piece of shit and I am not moving in the direction. I'm no longer an athlete. And I mean, like, I know I'm not even really being funny, because I mean, that is the internal dialogue for a lot of people. Is like, I mean, literally I had a call this Monday with a client who, we're in a fat loss phase, and she's like, yo, like at this, we're prepping for the build. Like, we're getting mentally prepared for it because it's something that she struggled with historically. And it's specifically the psychological that in which she has found the most challenging. So I'm like, okay, we have to first identify what that point is for you psychologically, in which you say, past this weight and I hate myself. And you know what? There's people who say, oh, don't self-deprecate, don't be so dramatic. Okay, but it's not my place or your place, frankly, to gaslight how anyone's feeling, because those feelings, as extreme as they might seem, they very well might be what the individual is experiencing. And sure, that varies person to person based on the degree of, this cognition that they have around weight gain, but it is not useful just to tell someone like, okay, well, just get over it. Just decide that that is no longer where you draw the line in the sand. So with this client, for instance, like that scale weight for her is like the high 140s. So it's like 148. She's like, I've never been heavier than that. And I'm like, okay, well, so in order to set you up so we don't hit that zone of terror, let's just, I don't know, we can call it that. Sure, fuck it, why not? In order, that nice and flush is hitting hard. Okay, we're gonna keep going. In order to avoid that, like that zone of terror, that point, God, that sounds ridiculous. I don't want to call it that. I changed my mind. That point in which the athlete essentially is just like, I am struggling mentally, even like to want to step on the scale because of the repercussions, because of the state it puts me in when I see that number. We don't want to hit that right out the gate. And that's where I think the approach that I recommend taking, the approach that I would say is going to be more favorable for someone who struggles with the psychological aspects of weight gain, it's to put them in a position where at least we've got some time after we start building for them to feel it out, to feel safe, to feel comfortable with the approach. Because frankly, if I like, that point for me historically has been like 142, 143. In the past, I've always said, okay, I'm going to start my build like 10 pounds under that so that I'm not hitting that point relatively soon. And frankly, this is going to depend on how much runway you actually need to go in with versus that line in the sand, as far as like where you decide like, oh, this is too much. For some people, that like realistically is going to be like that line in the sand is going to be a body fat that still isn't productive and isn't conducive with them making the necessary improvements with training. And that's where I think being very clear about like, where is that point for the client? I think that's super important. And it's something that like, I think you do have to foster an environment that allows them to feel like they can really be honest around like what that point is for them. I mean, like for some people it is truly like 5, 6, 7 pounds above stage weight. And past that, they're like, I struggle. Like I really struggle with body image. If you don't know where this point is for that client, or for yourself, for instance, and it's not to say if you don't have a line in the sand, maybe, hey, don't draw one. But if you don't know where that is, then it could just sneak up on you. And it could be a point of contention where the client, or in this case, yourself, you kind of throw your hands up. You're like, okay, now once I start to feel this way, I no longer want to feel this way. So that means I need to end the phase that I'm currently in. That's what we don't want. That's what we want to avoid. Now there's the other aspect related, in the same discussion around runway that I think is really important to consider. And that's physiologically, how productive is this to keep gaining body fat? Now, again, highly individual as far as like where a person feels this point is in their intentional growth phase. I can say for me, having now pre-collected data, and when I say data, the points that I'm actually going to get to in this video, scale weight, measurements, skinfold sites, training performance, adaptive components. So we got 5 right here. I've pre-collected this data in a way to where I have the data points, I have where these numbers typically lie, like the sum value. I have those, for instance, like the measurements, skinfold sites, not sides. I have those when I'm my leanest. I've had those for, like when I'm truly like just inside out peeled. I also have those when I've been my heaviest. And I have those at my heaviest in many different looks. So like I have essentially those data points collected. So I know, okay, like at the point where I'm going to say, the point I was at a higher body fat, like truly, like I was at, like 145, but like the composition was not in which something I would say is like reflective of someone getting to 145 with a strict program. Like I did it in a very sloppy manner. I was very lazy in how I got to that weight. And I'm kind of talking about like the prep in which I started in 22. So I mean, like I was around 143, 145. I have those skinfold sites. And then I also have the skinfold sites when I started my next diet that was not a prep. I have the skinfold sites in which I started a different intentional growth phase. And now I have the skinfold sites where I started this past point. And as those continue to progress, because currently I am in a build, I can contrast those across like, phase to phase and really see, okay, like are these numbers, are they reflective of body fat gain relative to circumference, relative to training performance? And ultimately, I think that having data points across, a very wide horizon, I think that can be helpful because for one, like going into this build, like I started where I would say I didn't start with as much runway as I have historically. And that in itself, it did make me nervous because I was like, I think I'm going to hit that point in my build where I start to feel a little uneasy. I start to feel like, maybe this is getting a little too soft. Maybe body fat is creeping up a little too high. I'm going to hit that within the first, 6 weeks. And frankly, I don't know if mentally I'm prepared to hit that. So for me, in this build, this has been incredibly important is looking at those previous data points and analyzing them in respect to one another. So like when I go through these metrics, because I think these are ones that each of y'all should be tracking to some extent. And like, I mean, the skinfold sites is one, like a lot of people be like, you really want me to take my body fat every single week? Guys, I'm talking about like a tool from Amazon. Like truly, it is a tool that is like, I don't know, it's like $15-20. It's not an electronic thing. Like it's just you pinch the body fat, the pinchable fat, that's what we're measuring. So I'm not even talking about something that's like gathering and like spitting out a percentage for you, because frankly, I don't think those are very accurate. I think those leave a lot of room for error. And then if we're looking at something like, that's not a home device, which like home devices, I think have a lot of limitations, especially the electronic ones. If we're looking at something that's not a home device, like a DEXA, like a bod pod, or even like going to a gym and getting a trainer to do it, these leave a ton of room for mismeasurements to occur, which ultimately, if you're using these measurements to make decisions around what you plan to do in the future and whether or not you plan to continue building or continue, at the same intake, or, in retrospect, if you're considering whether or not you need to then increase food. It's like you can't have wild swings in the discrepancies around these measurements if the measurements are the primary tool you're using to make these decisions. So we've got scale weight, measurements, skinfold sites, training performance, and adaptive components. So I'm going to go through each of these with you and tell you just my take, how they've been useful for me, specific to this build, as well as what I recommend in terms of using them to your advantage in terms of decision making. So number one, scale weight. when to take it, how often to take it, what to expect, what this means. Now, what I'll say, okay, when to take it. This is going to be one that you want to take first thing in the morning. There's a lot of people who are like, oh, okay, well, if I don't go to the bathroom in the morning, then I'm not going to take my scale weight. And that's something like, hey, to your discretion, if that's something you want to kind of roll the dice on, depending on how digestion actually looks, that could be problematic, because if you're someone who only uses the bathroom like 3 times a week, well, you're only going to get those 3 measurements a week, maybe. So what I tend to tell people is like, if you can make this as consistent as possible, that's going to be in our best favor. Some people, if digestion is good, I'll be like, okay, cool, take it at the same time every morning if you're pretty regular. In the case that someone's irregular, maybe there's the consideration around, can we just take it before you have a bowel movement? Can we just take it like literally first thing, like pee, whatever. But just on the off chance that digestion is irregular, at least we have that first read first thing in the morning. Now, some people, I will say, like in the case that, like for Jordan, for instance, so my boyfriend, he is currently trying to gain weight. He is not at all bothered by the scale weight. With his background, I mean, he's very familiar with seeing those fluctuations. And for him, we're actually looking at the PM weight as well, which is also something that for competitors towards the end of a prep, I'm looking at, because in like the aspect of comparing PM weight to AM weight, there is a pretty consistent drop that individuals will experience. And like in the case that someone needs to be waking up roughly a certain weight, that's a data point that we can then use to kind of make decisions around that final meal, or whether or not that individual, like if we need to predict, okay, are they going to wake up lighter than they've been waking up? Using that PM weight over the span of 7 days, 14 days, that can be really telling. Now, in the case of someone trying to build, do I think that you need to take PM weight? No, not necessarily. In Jordan's case, it does make sense, because he can tolerate a very high caloric intake. And then frankly, like for that, if he's going to wake up already, let's say, even if he hits everything to a T, but if he's burning through his food so effectively, and we can essentially predict, like going to bed, if he's under 200 pounds, then more than likely he's going to wake up lighter than he wants to be. So that might mean increasing food just slightly. Now, we're not doing that like on a day-to-day basis, but that is something that if it were to come down to it, if he were needing a higher intake, I guess we're not doing that regularly because it's not really necessitated, because his intake is truly as appropriate, I would say, as it can be at this point, to ensure that he's seeing that transient, very steady rate of gain. Going back to the example though, like for the individual who isn't taking PM weight, just taking AM weight, I really do think that you need to have 7 data points in a week. Sure, like for some individuals, maybe if one of those data points is heavily skewed on account of they didn't sleep well, maybe they, did fall behind on food, and like we know that weigh-in is going to be ultra light or ultra heavy. Maybe if you want to skip that weigh-in entirely, you can, but typically what I would recommend is that even if we know that there's an outlier scale weight, a scale weigh-in for the week, I would still track it. And then when you look at your average, if you're using like a spreadsheet like I am, where it's literally just in that bottom cell, like equal sum of the following rows, cool, I would just delete that one. I would just compare, like, what's the difference if you remove that outlier? So even in terms of like what to expect from your day-to-day scale weight and how that reads off of previous days, I can tell you, I don't have a single client, I've never worked with a single client that has consistently just a linear decrease in scale weight. Like no one that I've ever seen, if they were to track weight every single day for multiple weeks in a row, no one is just consistently trending down. And that was a concept for me when I started bodybuilding that was very difficult for me to understand. Like frankly, I wanted to deny it. I didn't want to believe it. But I was one of those people that frankly, like the scale weight would influence my decisions around food day to day, which I think is unnecessary and ultimately pretty detrimental to someone who, is still in that development phase. They're still learning how to take a step back and look at the macro rather than hyperfixate on these single and very acute data points. And I think for most people, what you're going to find is that scale weight does fluctuate even when you're 100% adherent. So Even following the program exactly to the T, I would still expect roughly a range of anywhere from 4 to 5 pounds when you consider your high versus your low. Now, that's another thing in the spreadsheets that I build out for clients. A lot of people, they will get, caught up in looking at like, okay, in more of like a linear fashion. Okay, Sunday through Saturday, I haven't lost any weight. And, I'll get that in email responses. They'll be like, my weight hasn't moved. But what I'll be interpreting from what they're saying is that they haven't seen a new low weigh-in. Their low weigh-in is consistent throughout the week. Yet, when I look at their average, when I compare their average from this week collectively compared to last week, we can see that there is, in the case of someone losing fat, we can see that's decreasing. Now, inversely, we want the opposite to happen when we're gaining. We want the high, we want the low to both go up. But I think for a lot of people, it can be very off-putting if for whatever reason they're in a position where they're not seeing that low weigh-in over the course of 3, 4, 5 days, and they're still just looking at that low weigh-in and they're like, okay, weight's going up way too fast. The high's there. Maybe we're just like hovering in the same, 1 to 2 pounds for a couple days, which ultimately in a build phase, that's really good. That's exactly what we want to see. We don't want to see these very acute, very rapid spikes in weight that never tend to drop off. But ultimately, the bottom line is that like with scale weight, if you are in a build, we have to see that go up. That is not negotiable. If you are someone who, and like I had a consult recently where someone was like, okay, but I'm looking to build and I'm not seeing the scale go down. And I'm like, those are two opposing goals. Like if you were looking to build, the scale weight is gonna have to go up. Like I know it's not something that you want to believe. I know it's something that you want to think, okay, we can just do this fucking like recomp and like I can look sick, I can look leaner, and like in theory, yeah, maybe to some extent there's a short period where you can recomp. But for someone who needs to make meaningful changes to their physique, for someone who really needs to grow, who needs to add a significant amount of size. And like for some people, when you think 5 pounds, that is significant. Like that is a lot of tissue to add. If you're thinking like purely muscle, I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but in order to do that, that absolutely means that scale weight is going to have to go up. Even if body fat does not change whatsoever, even if body fat stays exactly the same, scale weight will have to go up. And if that's something that ultimately is the bottleneck, is the limiting factor, because like you're so tied to the scale weight going up that ultimately you're making decisions to have kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the build itself, you're kind of just wasting your time. You might as well just be in a fat loss phase, because at this point you're not really in an effective build. All right, the niacin is starting to chill out a little bit, thank Lord. Okay, next up we've got measurements. Actually, no, before we go to that, I just want to say on scale weight, it's good to have a timeline. It's good to have it pre-planned and to kind of like have it mapped out on, some kind of format. Like, okay, if I gain 0.5 pound to 1 pound for the next 8 to 12 weeks, here's where that puts me. Now, the whole attachment to how this looks relative to your last stage weight. Let me be super clear. I don't think that someone needs to gain 30, 40 pounds in order to build muscle. I want that to be taken away from here. I don't think that that is necessary. And I think specifically the time frame in which you gain that weight is very, very important to the statement I'm about to make. If you are hung up on like, hey, I need to be within 15 pounds of my stage weight or 20 pounds of my stage weight, like I understand that is a very scary thing to think like, okay, I'm already 15 pounds, but Corey, you're saying I might have to be plus 10 or plus 12 pounds heavier than that in order to build the muscle that I need to build. The context matters. The context matters. Were you as lean as you need to be? Were you too lean? There are a wave of people who are coming in now too lean to their shows. And that's something that frankly, if that's the case, you're doing so to compensate for a lack of muscle mass. So we need to, one, be really aware around when we talk about what was our previous stage weight and now the current weight that we're at. If you've used diuretics and you were able to drop, another 5 pounds off of your stage weight, in the course of your peak week or whatever, that isn't really reflective of how lean you actually were. Your stage weight, you did a dehydration process. You brought in this super tight, super dehydrated package to stage. But if you're comparing your growth and like basically how much weight you're allowed to gain based on a dehydrated weight, that number is going to be heavily skewed. So I want to state that because I know a lot of people, they get caught up in like myself too. I'm like, I don't want to be 30 pounds above my stage weight. But frankly, if that stage weight was not where I needed to be in terms of like, if that was too lean, which mine was, then we have to consider, okay, what is the stage weight that is more appropriate, that fits the criteria, that fits the needs of the division, which in frank, like if you have enough muscle, you wouldn't need to be as lean. So then, then we move on to like measurements, skinfold sites, because this I think really is the meat and potatoes of what we need to focus on. Measurements, what I mean here is the circumference of different body parts. Now, when we're talking about like shoulders, I don't mean measuring like I don't mean that. I mean measuring circumference. So similar to how you measure bust, waist, hips, that's how we're measuring shoulders. Like the widest point right here, that's how we're measuring across. Now, when you consider shoulder to hip to waist ratio, you're going to hear top coaches, you're going to hear people even say like there needs to be a specific variance, like a difference in your shoulders to your hips to your waist. And yes, I heavily subscribe to that thought process, but you also have to consider some people are built more broad, like clavicularly, like my bones, they come out further than some people's. Now my hips, my actual like iliac crest, like that is not as wide as some people's are. So basically built like an upside down, like a snow cone, basically without the top. So just a cone. But when we consider what needs to happen, like where we need to take measurements, how often we need to take them, and how to interpret them. The big ones that I think people need to take, and this is very specific to the individual that is in the bikini division. If you're in wellness, sorry, it's not that I'm not trying to include this. It's just like, it's pretty much the same thing, except you need more leg. You kind of need to treat the leg the same way as I'm going to describe you need to treat the glutes. So the areas that I want to measure very specifically for the bikini competitor or the person who's trying to achieve the bikini competitor look, I want to look at the shoulders. So again, circumference, not like individual, like bicep, like not that. I want to look at the waist at the narrowest point. And then I want to look at the glutes. Now, historically, I've done waist vacuumed. I've done waist like relaxed, flexed, like I've done like widest point, narrowest point. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that much. I mean, like if you want to take them, fine, by all means. But what I can tell you is that you need one measurement for the waist, you need one measurement for the shoulder, and one measurement for the glutes at the widest point. Those are the ones I'm going to say are the most important. And actually, no, the four that are the most important, the three I just mentioned, as well as the glute fold. Now, the glute fold, what I mean when I say that, I mean the crease, the area in which your butt has a crease in it, the actual, like the cheek part of it. That is typically where most people's tie-ins are located. Yeah, if you have long tie-ins, like I have pretty long tie-ins, they go down to my fucking knees. They, like the bottom of the tie-in is like really low for me. And you'll see this with some people, like they just sit super low. Others you'll see like right at the top, like right as soon as their glute stops, like that's where the tie-in is. And like for that individual, I mean, again, highly individualized, but I do feel like it makes sense to have the glute fold measurement. And here's why. In bikini, that is probably the most important part of your back pose, is whether or not we can see tie-in, whether or not we can see the visibility there. Now, in terms of measurement versus skinfold sites, I really want to know what is the visibility, what can I see based on this person, like these data points. So that's largely going to come from the skinfold sites. But in terms of someone who's growing, I want to see measurements. I want to see that glute fold, because that essentially is going to tell me, are we getting more bottom tie-in? Are we in the case, like, yeah, like it, I'm not going to fucking tell someone, be like, hey, if you have low tie-ins, you need to measure right at the very like base. Like, I'm not going to do that, because frankly, it is going to be so nuanced. And I mean, like, if you want to do it that way, that's fine. This way works standardly for most people, for all people. It works for everyone 100% of the time. The other thing you have to consider is that this is where a lot of individuals store body fat. So in the case of a build, if you are, let's say you're like Jen Dory, and I mean, Jen has a beautiful physique and she stores body fat very favorably in her hips, in her lower body. Now, this is someone that I would say is like, okay, if we're measuring glute growth, we know that like we're going to see expansion of this circumference of this measurement, probably alongside weight gain, to ensure that this is actual like muscle coming on, that this is the quality of size of poundage that we want to see. Yes, we might see skinfold sides go up in this area, but we want to see that measurement going up as well. Now, I'm going to get into skinfold sites next, so that's going to make a lot more sense. But continuing on measurements, I also personally, like I want to see, I expect to see some leg development because, like, frankly, I don't have quads. Like, I don't, like, people, they're very deceived. They think they're, oh, you have like pretty big legs. Like, you should do wellness. Like, you're insane. It's a facade. It is body fat. I promise. Like, there's very little quad. If you saw my last competition, like, it was just like, just straight, just bone and like, just not quad. I digress. So I expect to see, as my glutes grow, I expect to see my legs go up. But what I want to ensure is happening is that I'm not seeing VMO develop excessively. Like, I'm going to see some development. I'm going to see some of that lower quad come up as I gain weight, as I have gained weight. But I don't want to see that develop to a point that is faster than the development of that glute, or let's say, or is, I guess, how do I want to say this? I want to see the rate at which all parts of my leg are developing, because I want to essentially know, okay, if I need to make a modification to training, I want it to be rooted in something that's objective. I don't want it to be rooted in a sensation like I feel my quads working excessively. When you have negative quads, just like any body part that's untrained, it's going to bitch and moan when it has to do any work. So when I do upper body exercises, because I don't train arms, whenever my biceps are recruited on account of my lats failing, they bitch and moan. I can feel them, and they're very upset that they have to participate whatsoever because they're very lazy because they aren't recruited often. It's the same thing with my quads. And I would say, like, the thing that has honestly really been helpful for me, and I mean, like, y'all don't have access to this, so apologies. Training with Jordan, working with Jordan. Jordan's been doing my coaching for training specifically. When I've communicated, like, hey, I feel my quads. He's like, it doesn't matter. Like, it just doesn't. There's no you're gonna feel your quads, yeah, but like, frankly, your quads are not, like, they are not moving they're not moving the weight the way that you might imagine based on the sensation. Like, your brain, you're not going to be able to differentiate the sensation of the quads and be like, okay, that is your quad going into flexion. Like, frankly, the movements that you're doing, they are very glute biased, and your quad coming into play, that's just because of the discrepancy in muscle and muscularity that's currently present in your physique. That is actually a testament to you're feeling your quads, likely because your glutes are at the point where they're beginning to fail, which is what we want. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It's not actually taking away because these movements are so specific to being glute biased. So when we look at measurements, which ones to take, kind of went through them. Shoulders, one point of your waist, glutes at the widest point, glute fold, so right at the butt crease, right at the upper part of the thigh, the lowest point of the glute, on account of most people's tines are relatively going to fall within that range. I personally do 3 points on my leg. You don't have to. Like, that could be arguably excessive. I do my adductor. I do like the widest point of my thigh, like where my adductor is meaty. I do a midpoint on my thigh, and then I do right at the knee. Whether you do that or not, it frankly doesn't matter. I store a lot of body fat in my legs anyway, so it's like, okay, like I'm going to see a increase in circumference there, whether it is tissue or body fat. I do want to keep an eye on it. I do want to measure it in contrast with skinfold sites. Now, how often do we need to take these measurements? Once a week is plenty. Any more than that, and like it really, you're not going to see much. And like frankly, even once a week, you're probably not going to see much of a change. I can tell you with my measurements. So at this point, I have been in a build for roughly 7 weeks. In terms of the changes that I've seen collectively, 7 weeks, I've seen 6 inches in totality come up on my entire body. Now, you have to keep in mind, like, one of those is my waist. When you look at like my shoulders, okay, they've come up like 1.2 inches. My glutes, they've come up 1.5 inches. My legs, like those 3 different points, I mean, like collectively, those are individual measurements. So we're looking at the sum, but in the sum, in 6.5, 7 weeks, 6 inches. Like, I mean, like we're not talking about a ton, and some of that change is irrelevant because it's not the change that we want to see. So when we really look like comparatively, like week to week, we're probably not going to see much of a change. And that's where measuring the same way every single week, that's where it's so important for you to do. So I would use like landmarks, like birthmarks, a specific, if you're using a fucking tape measure, like, I mean, measure up from your knee. This is the point in which use your belly button, use a point on your shoulders, like try to do it the same way every single time. And personally, I would rather do it myself. I think if I had someone else do it, I think frankly, it's going to be a greater degree of discrepancy in how they measure. Now, the next one, and I'm going to tie this into like collectively how this all fits together. We've got skinfold sites. Now for this, personally, I'm taking a lot of points for skinfold sites, but the big ones I'm going to take serratus, belly button, lower back, the upper outer part of the glute, and the lower outer part of the glute. I'm also going to take those 3 points on my legs, so upper, mid, and lower. Now, this in itself, for me, this is helping build a very comprehensive picture as to what changes are actually happening. What is the degree, what is the discrepancy, the change in pinchable fat week to week, and is that pinchable fat in contrast with measurements acceptable? So in this case, like, you know, I've been building for 6.5, 7 weeks. I'm going to say, like, this has been the most productive build that I've had thus far. Like, and I have the data points from the last time I did this. My pinchable fat started out at, collectively, the sum was 86.5 millimeters. As of this past week, I'm at 81.4. So when you look at the measurements compared to the skinfold sites, and that's really where I want you to make this assessment, like understand how to do this assessment. You might not see body fat go down. And like, I think Jordan's, that's why I think his is a really good reference point. His are even more impressive, but his body fat didn't go down. So let's say he's been in a build for, at this point, truly like 8-9 weeks. His measurements have gone up roughly, like 17 inches. Like he's built more of him, like in that amount of time. His body fat, even though his body fat itself, like, yes, we can collectively see that it's gone up. And frankly, so is mine. Mine has certainly gone up. It's just the discrepancy in which it has gone up. In its specific areas that are frankly getting more circulation now that maybe weren't getting this degree of circulation, in specific areas like my legs that now are getting trained because of the amount of load that I'm pushing. But okay, let me go back to his example. So in, let's say, 8-9 weeks, gone up about 17 inches in terms of that circumference, that measurement, and his body fat, it's only gone up 10 millimeters. Like, so it's not 10%, but when you look at like pinchable fat, like millimeters, that's such a small change, such a small change. And when you think 17 inches, like that's huge. So this is where I really want you to understand, like, you might not see a linear correlation, and you might see that like what I can reflect back on is like my last build, I didn't start to see body fat gain until the later half of it. So I built for 12 weeks. The first 6 weeks, I kind of just held constant, like circumference went up, body fat held the same. The last 6 weeks, body fat began to go up. And again, it was all it was all tracked and it was all, structured in a way that it was like, okay, this is acceptable. We're not seeing these wild swings in body fat. So that's good. That's what we're looking for. But at this point, now knowing what I've shared with you, now knowing that like, okay, measurements have gone up 6 inches, body fat's gone down. That's strange. When you look at the change in scale weight, I started this build off like roughly 136-ish, kind of. My weekly weigh-in is like 143. So I mean, like 7 pounds in 7 weeks, you would be like, that's a little too fast, Corey. Like that probably indicates that you're putting on more fat than muscle. Here's where having these 3 data points, and we haven't even gotten to training and like adaptive components, but here's where having these 3 data points and collectively comparing one to another is going to allow you to make better decisions that are rooted in logic, that are rooted in, that are how do I want to say this? That are not, essentially, that are not rooted in emotion. Because I can tell you, like in this course, this builds for me, it's been really hard. It's been really hard because I went into it, it's been really hard mentally. It's been very easy physically. And even though, yes, like I do feel as if my body fat has gone up, I have to think that on some level, a big part of this is because I'm seeing scale weights that I've previously deemed as like, I'm not comfortable, like over 140. I'm not comfortable at this weight. I don't like how I feel. I just feel like a bigger person. Now, when you look at measurements, scale weight, skinfold sites, also on skinfold sites, how often do we need to take these? Roughly once a week. Once a week is plenty. And I would say again, like with measurements, skinfold sites, same way you would go about doing your like typical weekly check-in. This needs to be something that you do on a day that is truly reflective of like an average day in the week. Like don't do it after a day that you've had very poor sleep. Don't do it after a day that you had a cheat meal. I mean, like, yes, for continuity, you need to do it roughly every 7 days. But if you know that like, okay, didn't use the bathroom, I had like, a bunch of shit come up at work yesterday, so stress is really high. So you're kind of going into these check-in points with skewed data. Skewed data is not helpful. So this is important if you're going to be making decisions based on this kind of data to gather it in a way that is as accurate as the previous week. Now, the other thing that we're going to tie in here is training performance. This is one that a lot of people, they lose sight of and they think, okay, well, as long as I'm getting transiently stronger, then it's fine. But what I really want to see, and what I've seen with myself, is that in the case of someone whose weight is going up, let's say faster than they would like it to, faster than they'd expect, the checkpoints that I'm looking for to make sure that I'm okay with it, that it's acceptable. Because as a coach, that's essentially like I'm trying to protect you from putting you in a position where you are gaining body fat faster than you're gaining muscle. If it's a 1-to-1 ratio, okay, like that's sick. But that ultimately is going to shorten the runway in which you can do this for. If we can skew that ratio to where you're gaining more muscle than you are fat, even better. That's the pinnacle. And to ensure that that is actually happening, to ensure that you are actually seeing those results, the things that I want to see, absolutely want to see scale weight go up week to week. Ideally, I want to see it go up in a controlled fashion, but like if it's going up rapidly, the things that make that okay, if circumference is going up in the areas that we want it to. So outside of waist, I want all of the other body parts to get bigger. Like I want the glutes to get bigger. I'm okay with the legs getting a little bigger. I want the shoulders to get bigger. I don't want the waist to get bigger. So when I compare my previous, like my starting waist measurement compared to now, I'm like, okay, well, collectively, I've gained a total of 6 inches on my body. My waist measurement in itself has gone up 1/2 inch, like hardly. That's really good. That's exactly what I want to see. So that's green light in my book, but we're not done yet. Now I want to look at calipers, at skinfold sites, at the metric in which we're going to derive whether or not body fat is being gained. So when we look at where the fats come on, and you have to understand, like skinfold sites are not 100% accurate. There's going to be some discrepancy, even just based in like fluid retention and like how some days you're going to wake up, you're going to be more inflamed. You're going to be a little less recovered. So yes, we might see discrepancies, measurement to measurement, but collectively, what is it that we're seeing? Now, the areas that I don't really want to see body fat go up, belly button, lower back, even on the legs, like those are areas that where I'm predisposed to see more pinchable fat. Now, when I say we don't want to see fat, fat's gonna accumulate. Like, you're going to see body fat come on. We just don't want to see it come on faster than which it is coming on. I guess, no, that's not true. Let me rephrase that. If it's coming on in these areas that are, let's say, areas that we also want muscle to build, like I want more glutes. Cool. Okay. If there is any kind of discrepancy, and let's say like that pinchable area is the same, okay, well, that's good. That's a positive in my book. If we are not seeing any kind of increase in body fat gain in those areas, cool. Now, where do I expect the body fat to come on? It's probably going to be in those ranges that we technically don't want to see. There's no reason. We don't expect growth. So let's say the core, for instance, I'm not training my core. So it's more likely and more acceptable to see that there's some, again, very, very minor. We're talking about 1-2 millimeters. Even then, that's not going to be happening every single week. If that changes, well, it's less of a surprise because we're not necessarily training that muscle for growth. Whereas if I'm seeing circumference go up of my glutes, but I'm seeing body fat go up, at a faster rate than that, that's not favorable. That's not what I want to see. I ideally would like to see that body fat is holding the same, if not getting lower, which is essentially what I've seen at this point. My upper glutes, they have hardly changed whatsoever. They're roughly the same measurement in which they started. My lower glute started at around 14 millimeters, a little bit over that. And over the last several weeks, what have I seen? It's gone down about 3 or 4 millimeters. Now, why is this? What can I derive having that information? I can derive that, maybe what is being pinched, maybe there is something that is not of fat content, so fat-free content that is now pushing against the skin. So whatever I'm pinching, it is not as fat dominant. Really though, what I think you need to take away from this is that if that's happening in the measurements and skinfold sites alongside scale weight, theoretically, we should see, and I would say even past theoretically, it's very important that we see improvements in training performance. And if that's not something that you're actively tracking, it's going to be very difficult to derive whether or not there are actually improvements occurring and whether or not muscle is being built. So I can tell you that for the last 7 weeks, my training has been very standardized, not to a point where I feel it is, to a detriment. There have been modifications that have been made based on what I'm feeling, based on different changes I've seen week to week. But I can say with a lot of my primary movements, with my B stance RDL, with my squat pattern, with my hinge, I've made huge leaps and strides ahead in the weight that I'm lifting. By far, this is the strongest that I've ever been. At this point, I've made one adjustment to calories only because, again, I'm continuing to see body fat technically go down. Even though I feel fatter, even though I feel bigger, what I'm seeing on measurements is that body fat is going down, which is positive. Now, this alongside training performance consistently going up, this is exactly what I'd like to see, ideally. Now, let's say in the case that someone's training performance isn't going up, but we're seeing that circumference is going up and body fat's going up, and body fat maybe is going up a little bit faster than we'd expect. That might be a point where we have to consider, okay, what is the limiting factor relative to training? Why isn't training performance going up? Now, this lends to that final metric, and that's adaptive components, the recoverability. I really want to see that someone is able to recover in a meaningful way relative to each session so that their next session, they are able to go in and make some kind of improvement. Now, I kind of skip past this, but with training performance, a lot of people will jump to load and be like, okay, that is the thing that needs to be progressed. And yes, I think highly with our demographic, there is this belief that if you lift too heavy, you are going to build your physique in a way that is not favorable for bikini. Frankly, I don't think that's possible. I know that's not possible. I know it's not possible. I think if you train very hard aimlessly, yes, you could build proportions that are not favorable for bikini, but in terms of the actual tissue being built, it's not like if you were following a training program that is designed specifically for the bikini look. It's not like you're going to accidentally fall outside of that unless you are somehow using all secondary muscles that are not intended to do the movements that you're trying to do. Just because you haven't progressed weight doesn't necessarily mean that training performance hasn't gone up. We can look at the amount of the amount of reps being performed. We can look at the quality of each rep. Now, this is one that, like, I would say, if you are someone who is unfamiliar with what true failure feels like, this could be a really good opportunity for you to go in and set at least benchmarks for different types of movements and figure out, okay, here is the point in which I am truly failing technically on this movement. Realistically, like with like a hinge or with like, so an RDL, if that's something that you have in your program, which you absolutely should highly recommend, it's very unlikely you're going to hit muscular failure prior to hitting technical failure. And this is one that a lot of people, they will, kind of complain about, and myself included, and be like, well, I don't feel it in my glutes, and I don't feel like my glutes have fatigued prior to a secondary muscle group like my core. Okay, but the fact is you're doing a hinge movement. You're doing a movement that, assuming that you're doing it correctly, like from a technical standpoint, there's no way your glutes aren't working. Like that just is fact. Like that is the case. Like, yes, the sensation might vary depending on several different factors, but there's no way that you are hinging, if you are actually truly hinging correctly, that your glutes are not taking a predominance of the load. Now, in the case that, let's say, you're finding that technical breakdown is occurring sooner than, like so much sooner than the muscular stimulation, the sensation that you're after, maybe not with like a hinge, but like with something that is externally braced. So maybe like a leg press, or even like, I don't know, like a kickback. Okay, then we need to improve the technique. We need to improve the skill of the movement. Now, that's something that you can use to objectively say, like, I have made progress in my training performance. Like, my performance has improved because I've gotten better at this skill. Now, if you're getting better at the skill, even though weight might be the same, even over the course of, let's say, 7 weeks, just because you're lifting the same weight, if you're doing it better, if the quality of each rep is being done in a way that's conducive with you getting a better stimulus out of it, that is a performance increase. Now, from here, we can start getting very rigid with like, okay, here's the target working rep range I want you to be within. So and again, not all exercises are created equally. So there's going to be a fatigue cost associated with each type of movement, something that is more of a compound movement, a squat pattern, a hinge. Yeah, you're going to find that different body parts are going to fail prior to the body part that you were predominantly trying to focus on. Now, because of that, you're going to ultimately be able to leverage, and I guess really, how should I say this? You're going to be able to focus on, you're going to be able to go into the movement with a focus on loadability as opposed to just tension. Now, with an isolation movement where loadability is a constraint, even something like a hip thrust, and loadability is a constraint for hip thrust in a completely inverse fashion, but something like a kickback, okay, well, loadability, that's going to be a ceiling in which you hit very quickly. Same thing with like a rear delt fly or a lateral raise. Now, if that's the case, you have to create means in which you spend more time putting the muscle under tension. So that might be incorporating something like a tempo. That might be working up to a higher number of reps per set. But really, if you have a means in place, and like, I guess what I'm trying to get at with this, because I don't want this to be just like a technical segment around training. If you have a means to track your training, you're already doing better than a lot of people, because essentially what we need to do is there needs to be intention with the type of movement you're doing. So if that's not there, start firstly with like, am I doing the same movements or relatively the same movements each workout? And it's not like lower 1, lower 2, lower 3. I'm not saying each of those days do exactly the same workout. I mean, lower 1 week to week needs to be the same movements, needs to be roughly the same amount of sets. That those are not things that we should be undulating often. Like, if the program is designed well, we should be able to instill that follow the program, and then only adjust as needed. Now, then once you have the target rep range, let's say the target rep range is, 10 to 15 reps. Okay. If you've standardized the movements that you're doing and the number of working sets you're doing, okay, now let's standardize the way that you're doing each movement. So that means aiming for an intensity that is repeatable. So having an objective way to quantify the intensity that you're performing each set at. Now, what I like to do is use a metric kind of like RIR or RPE. So use an intensity scale that essentially allows you to dictate, hey, I have hit true failure. In this case, that means like objectively, you are hitting a point close to the end of the set. So if the target rep range is 10 to 15, maybe around reps 8, 9, 10, maybe that's the point where you see a decrease in the velocity of the rep speed. So you go down for a squat and on the way up, instead of being able to just finish it at an exact same velocity, you hit a little bit of a decreased velocity. You hit kind of a sticky point. We don't need to come to a complete stop. We don't need the rep to be, you don't need to grind it out. It's great if you can, but there are recovery costs associated with that. So in the case that you've now standardized intensity, so every set you're going like, hey, I'm trying to hit an RIR of 1 to 2 or an RPE of 8, 9, 10. Cool. Okay. From here, now the goal is to progress to that upper end of the rep range. Once you hit that upper end of the rep range, maybe at that point, that should occur roughly within like 3-4 weeks. Okay, if you're doing that, if you have been successful, now you're at the upper end of the rep range, maybe the answer is to increase weight. However, if you increase weight and your form breaks down, that like the technical side of this, the skill just isn't there, that might be an indication that maybe you need to stay at that prior weight and include something like a tempo. Spend more time getting stronger in that movement, developing that skill. What I can say is that when you take all of these metrics and weigh them and compare them side by side, but also, assess, okay, what is happening? If you have things in place that support whether or not the weight being put on is favorable or unfavorable, it's really hard to fuck up this intentional growth phase. And that's really the message I want you to take away from this, is that just like with the fat loss phase, by definition, if you are moving in the right direction and in a build, the right direction is gaining weight. And even though it's not as simple as like, okay, well, I gained weight, why wasn't it muscle? We need to have context. So we need to have an understanding as to whether or not the weight that is coming on is truly favorable. And the things that I think are going to allow you to have a better depiction of whether that weight is favorable, those things, measurements, skinfold sites, training performance. And if you have these things in place, I promise you, you can go through an intentional build and you can essentially guarantee that you're not going to be blindsided by this unnecessary fat gain. I know this was a lot of info. I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.